the uncertainties of an unknown sea in search of a prize promised by the gods. These brave Scandinavian warriors had long heard of the rich lands of the Western Islands. They decided to take their chances in search of gold and glory. Off the coast of Northumbria, they encountered the Holy Island, where the monastery of Lindisfarne was located. The poor monks had no idea of the impending danger. The Vikings invaded the monastery and massacred the helpless clerics, who witnessed an unparalleled attack on the British Isles. No one had ever dared to attack such a sacred place in that territory. The invaders plundered all that was valuable in the monastery, enslaving some of the few survivors. News of the onslaught of the monastery of Lindisfarne quickly spread across Europe, and the fear of being invaded by the northern pagans took hold of the remainder of European Christian nations. The Viking era had begun. After returning home, the Viking hosts were welcomed as true heroes. With them, they brought riches in amounts never seen before. Jewels, precious metals, spices, and slaves were among the items brought as spoils from the invasions. Those adventures proved to be highly profitable. Driven by greed and the desire to achieve the level of fame attained by the first explorers, the number of boats and warriors that left and headed for the British Isles grew massively. Every summer, the northern men landed in Christian lands. The chaos and terror brought by those men made the inhabitants of Brittany believe that the final judgment was approaching, looking at the northerners as creatures sent by the devil. And in almost all their prayers, they cried out for God to protect them from the dreadful northern men. But they did not fear the Christian God, as they worshipped their own gods. These were warrior deities who favored those who showed courage in the face of danger and did not fear death on the battlefield. The worshippers of those war gods wished nothing but to conquer their place beside Odin in the glorious Valhalla. Nevertheless, the majority of the Nordics were not Vikings, never engaging in the expeditions. They were mostly farmers, traders, or craftsmen. Despite the brutality of their warriors, the general population was peaceful and fond of the arts. The Scandinavians had a rich culture. Their abundant religion not only glorified the warrior gods, the agricultural and fertility gods were also among the most worshipped, and the pursuit of spiritual ascendancy was among the goals of those who worshipped the Nordic gods. But the prosperity of peoples like the Norwegians was limited by the geography of where they lived. Despite its beautiful scenery, Norwegian lands were not particularly suited for agriculture, either because of the soil's low productivity, the long winters, or the geographic isolation. The search for a better life prompted thousands of Scandinavians to leave their homelands, to colonize distant territories such as Iceland, Greenland, and the British Isles. The people of Brittany, after decades of invasion, became accustomed to the Viking seasonal raids. By the time summer arrived, the Anglo-Saxons prepared for the inevitable invasions, fortifying their defenses. Then, they waited for the end of the plundering to follow their lives normally. But in 865 AD, a giant Viking army appeared on the horizon, led by the offspring of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, who, according to legend, wanted to avenge their father's death. This army had not come only to plunder. The goal was to conquer. If a handful of Vikings could already make Christians tremble in fear, a horde brought panic to all of England. At that time, the Kingdom of England did not exist yet. The lands were split into several smaller kingdoms. Their rivalries prevented the formation of a solid coalition to try to expel the invaders. Benefiting from that fragmentation, the Vikings reached diplomatic victories. They subjugated noble Anglos without spilling any blood, as they were to pay tribute and provide soldiers to strengthen the great pagan army. With no alternative but extinction, many knelt before the Vikings. In 866 DC, the great army marched against the city of York, the most important in the north of the British Island. Not even the mighty wall built by the Romans withstood the Nordic rage. Taking advantage of a Christian holiday, the Vikings surprised the city's inhabitants with an unexpected attack. After conquering York, the Vikings quickly subjugated the entire kingdom of Northumbria. After setting foot in England, the Vikings marched across the island, expanding their dominions and extorting resources from the noblemen who preferred to pay a bribe than face them. Albeit fearsome, the army wasn't big enough to control all the conquered regions. They decided to crown native puppet kings so that they could rule those domains, while paying a heavy tribute to the Vikings. Over the years, more and more warriors and settlers from Scandinavia arrived in England. The northern peoples took control of 2/3 of England, proving that they wanted to stay. Every sign indicated that the fall of the rest of England was a matter of time. But in the south of England, a kingdom resisted bravely against the Viking invaders. It was the Kingdom of Wessex, the richest and most powerful of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. With a large and organized army, it was the last defensive line of the Saxon people. Under the leadership of King Aethelred and his brother Alfred, the Saxons formed a coalition to fight the Scandinavians. Great battles ensued, and the Vikings encountered an outstanding resistance. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. The Saxons achieved some heroic victories and terrible defeats, but never softened in the face of the great Viking threat. Those battles wore both sides out. A truce was signed on condition that a tribute had to be paid to the noble Vikings. Some years of relative peace followed the truce, until a new Viking leader, known as Guthrum, motivated the Nordics to take the war back to the Wessex kingdom. With the death of King Aethelred, his brother Alfred was now the King of Wessex. With a privileged intellect, he developed his kingdom, rebuilt his army, strengthened his navy, and established the fortifications to face the war that would soon arrive. With a better trained and equipped army, Alfred guided his army to fight the pagan enemies. Carrying the symbols of Christianity, the Saxons believed that the true God was at their side, and their destiny was to push the invaders out of England. The war between the Anglo-Saxons and the Nordic invaders was inevitable. The fight for England was just beginning. The tale of the Berserker warrior at the Battle of Stamford Bridge is one of the most epic events in Viking history. The Battle of Stamford Bridge took place on September 25, 1066, near the village of Stamford Bridge in England. The English army, led by King Harold II, confronted the Viking invaders led by Harold III of Norway and Tostig Godwinson, Harold II's brother. Among the most noteworthy scenes of the battle was a lone Viking warrior, often described as a berserker, who single-handedly halted the advance of the English troops. Berserker warriors were famed for their combat rage, possibly brought on by rituals and the intake of intoxicating substances. They were regarded as so savage and fearless that, according to legend, they could feel no pain and were almost invincible. Indeed, as the English army tried to cross the bridge to confront the Vikings, a single Viking warrior positioned himself on the bridge and held off the advance of the English army, slaughtering several soldiers who were trying to pass. He continued to defend the bridge alone, wielding his axe and displaying amazing skill and strength. His demise was brought about, however, when an English soldier cunningly managed to slip under the bridge on a barrel and, using a spear, struck the Viking warrior from below, through the planks, fatally wounding him. The Battle of Stamford Bridge proved to be a decisive triumph for the English army and signaled the end of the Viking invasions of England. However, just 3 weeks later, Harold II would face another invader, William the Conqueror, at the Battle of Hastings, a battle he would not live through, and which would lead to the Norman domination of England. Although the identity of the ferocious warrior who single-handedly held back the English forces is unknown, the Vikings knew for certain that this valiant soldier had his spirit chosen by the Valkyries to live among the gods in Valhalla's glorious hall. the story of the Bridge Berserker has become one of the greatest icons of the courage and ferocity of Viking warriors. According to one Viking legend, a great Viking nobleman once conquered part of Scotland, only to find himself the victim of a bite from one of his enemies, who had already been dead for days. This Viking's name was Sigurd the Mighty. After having seized some territory in Scotland, he came up against the resistance of a valiant Pictish chieftain, who had been giving the Norwegian nobleman a hard time. The Pictish warrior's name was Maelbrigta the Bucktoothed, and to avoid a major bloodbath, he and Sigurd came to an agreement whereby the two armies would face each other in a battle of 40 against 40 soldiers. Sigurd, however, in a treasonous move, took with him 80 warriors instead of 40, and achieved an undeserved victory on the battlefield. Sigurd stuck Maelbrigta's head on his horse's saddle and proceeded to ride around Scotland flaunting it like a trophy, a powerful message to those who would dare oppose him. But it seems that the Norse war gods did not approve of Sigurd's deceitful deeds and arranged a tragic outcome for him. As he rode on his journeys, his enemy's head rotted, and Maelbrigta's teeth started to scratch Sigurd's leg, leading to small abrasions. This small wound got infected, and this proved impossible to contain, leading to a generalized infection that ultimately led to Sigurd's death from sepsis. The story of Sigurd the Mighty is a well-known example of poetic justice. His betrayal, post-victory hubris, and downfall became a tale used to symbolize how a person's doings can have unintended and even ironic consequences. Valhalla is the warrior's paradise in Norse mythology. It is a great hall where the warriors who perished bravely on the battlefields dwell. Valhalla is a huge structure in Asgard, the home of the gods. The ceiling is made of shields, and the walls are made of spears. In Odin's great hall, the brave fallen warriors enjoy great feasts in the evenings. The warriors inhabiting Valhalla spent the day practicing martial activities and dueling with each other. Should one of them die or be seriously injured, the night resurrects them, and their wounds are healed to join the nightly feasts in the company of the gods, with plenty of mead and wild boar meat. The Hall of the Dead has 540 huge doors, and 800 warriors can march side by side through each one. The promise of life after death in the Hall of Valhalla provided comfort to warriors going off to battle. If they were struck down in battle, they could reach the glorious Hall of Odin, where their spirits would continue to exist in a kind of Norse paradise. But, of course, most preferred to survive the battle and enjoy the triumph against their enemies. After a battle, the Valkyries would ride over the battlefield, choosing from among the fallen warriors those who had shown heroic courage against the enemy. Then they carried the souls of the fighters to the glorious hall. These warriors taken to Valhalla would join Odin's army. During their stay in Asgard, the fighters continued to train to be ready for combat when summoned. These warriors are destined to fight alongside the gods of Asgard during Ragnarok, a sort of Norse apocalypse. And during the grand battle of Ragnarok, they will have another opportunity to display all their courage by honorably facing the enemies of the gods.
Axes were one of the main weapons of the Viking Age, being considered the common man's weapon, given their efficiency in combat and low-cost production. The heads of the axes were made of iron and attached with wooden handles. Battle axes were distinguished by wide blades and downward projecting spurs, resembling the long beard worn by Viking warriors. For this reason, the weapon was also called a bearded axe. The axe's spur was used as a hook to pull the enemy's shield, leaving him vulnerable to attacks. Another terrifying axe used in battle was the Dane axe. The blade was light and very thin, with great cutting ability. The long handles could be up to 1.5 meters long, providing a great reach during combat. The sea axe was a long knife used by Viking and Saxon warriors. With a single edge and heavy blade, this slightly crude weapon was relatively simple to use and produce compared to the valuable swords. A wealthier warrior might have a larger seax, some as large as swords. Seaxes were usually carried in a scabbard suspended horizontally from the belt. Some seaxes were adorned with precious metal ornaments and elaborate designs, and were worn as a symbol of high status by warriors. Some people preferred to use a seax instead of a sword in combat, since a shorter weapon could be more effective during close combat against a shielded wall. The short blade was also more easily concealed behind a shield, ready to deliver a quick and unexpected blow or cut against the enemy. The spear was the most used weapon during the Viking Age. Like other cultures, the Vikings used spears as both attack and defense weapons. A well-placed wall of shields with spears pointing forward was a formidable obstacle in a battle. Spears could also be thrown at enemies, although models with shorter points and handles were used to accomplish this. The spear's points were made of iron. They were often decorated with precious metal inlays or geometric designs. The spearheads were attached to wooden shafts with a rivet, although these spears could measure 2 to 3 meters in length. Despite being a common weapon, the spear had great cultural significance for Viking warriors. It was the main weapon of Odin, king of the Norse gods and god of war. The sword was the most prestigious weapon in Norse society. Its production was intricate. For this reason, they were rare and overly expensive. Of the more than 100 weapons found in pagan burials from the Viking era in Iceland, only 16 were swords. This confirms that few warriors could have such a weapon. Members of the nobility or elite warriors usually owned swords. For this reason, swords were commonly passed down as family heirlooms or buried next to the owner's body. Kings and tribal chiefs could buy swords with guards, pommels, and handles adorned with precious metals and jewelry. Viking-era swords usually had 2 sharp edges and were usually used with one hand. The other held the shield. Some of the best Viking swords were imported from the Rhine region and had the name Ulfberth written on the blade. Although little known, the Vikings also had a halberd called the Altgeir. Many consider this halberd an ancestor of the medieval glaive. Others think the Altgeir was a variation of the Dane axe. Some halberds are described in the Norse sagas. However, no such weapons have been found in graves. They may have been rare or not part of the Viking funerary customs. The most famous user of the halberd in the Norse sagas was a warrior named Gunnar Hamadarson, who was able to wield the Altgeir with only one hand while holding a sword in the other. Gunnar was supposedly able to dismember and impale opponents with the halberd. In the Viking era, fighters used large round wooden shields. The Norse sagas specifically mentioned the wood of the lime tree for building the shields. A shield needed to be large enough to provide the desired protection. When a warrior made a shield for himself, he adapted it to cover at least his torso. Therefore, shields came in many sizes. The Vikings' shields were made of riveted wooden planks with a central hole for the hand. The shields were also highly decorated and some were painted with religious patterns or symbols. There was a domed iron protrusion in the center of the shield to protect the hand. Some Viking ships had side supports where the shields were mounted. They served as additional protection for the oarsmen and, through colors and symbols, also identify who was on board the ship. The helmets used in the Viking Age were generally quite simple. They were helmets with a prominent nose guard. The helmets were typically made with several pieces of iron riveted together. This made it easier to produce, but the strength was inferior compared to medieval elms. Other styles of helmets have been found in excavations. The best known is a helmet found in 10th century Norway. This helmet has a covering like spectacles, protecting much of the face, and allowing the eyes to have a good angle of vision. Wealthy warriors were able to have more decorated helmets with bronze inlays and detailed carvings. Contrary to widespread belief, the Viking helmets used in battle did not have horns. However, it is possible that helmets adorned with horns and bird wings were used in some ceremonies. Chainmail was the main body protection during the Viking Age and was worn by warriors from many distinct cultures. Usually, the garment was produced with short sleeves, the length of which reached down to the thighs. The chainmail was probably worn over thick clothing and protected the wearer from cuts. However, it offered very little protection against blunt trauma and attacks from sharp spear-like points. The 12 kilograms of iron in a chainmail meant a treasure trove in the Viking Age. Few people could afford this level of protection. The price of chainmails must have been remarkably high. The iron loops were passed individually through neighboring loops to form the chainmail. Then, the loops were sealed closed and sealed with a rivet. This process was repeated numerous times to make the chainmail. Lamellar armor is a type of body armor composed of small rectangular plates of iron or steel. Lamellar armor was not as popular as chainmail during the Viking Age. However, archaeological finds show that this type of armor was used in Scandinavian regions. According to historical sources, the Byzantine Empire of the Rus of Kiev partially influenced Viking armor. Some Vikings were mercenaries for both peoples. Although it seems innovative, lamellar armor was quite old. Evidence indicates that the Assyrians, in the early Iron Age, were responsible for this armor's development. Lamellar armor became most popular among the Vikings who sailed and lived in the Baltic region. Some Vikings had a rather peculiar horn on their waist called the Galarhorn, or war horn. In Norse mythology, this horn was associated with the god Heimdallar and the sage Mimir. The war horn could be used as a trumpet to give orders to troops in battles, or to indicate the presence of enemies. Another purpose of the horn was to act as a drinking receptacle, often used at feasts to drink the much-loved Viking mead. Some of these war horns were richly adorned with carvings and precious metals. Archaeologists' findings indicate that they were sacred horns kept only for religious purposes, a custom of the ancient Germanic peoples. There were also horns made entirely of metal, usually bronze. They were a family heirloom and prestigious symbols. Much of the inscriptions on Viking horns tell about the history of the family to which they belong.
The Vikings were one of the most feared warrior groups in history. Many epic sagas and poems were written to underline the bravery of the Vikings on the seas, sailing on their dragon ships. There are also several stories about courageous heroes and warlords who, with only a strong arm, a sharp blade, and a sagacious intelligence, conquered new lands and accumulated great fortunes. But among these renowned warriors, one name was synonymous with respect and admiration: Ragnar Lodbrok. The legendary Ragnar Lodbrok was a king of Denmark and Sweden during the 8th and 9th centuries. One of the main sources of his story is called the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, which explains that the term Lodbrok means hairy trousers, as his trousers were made of boiled wolf skin with tar, which made them thick and resistant. The exact birthplace of Ragnar is still a mystery. Sources differ between Sweden and Denmark. Son of the Swedish king Sigurd Hring, Ragnar was part of the Yngling, an ancient noble lineage of Swedish and Norwegian kings. According to the beliefs of the time, they were descendants of the gods of the Nordic pantheon. The first Yngling was a legendary king named Yngvi, son of Njord, the mighty god Vanir of the sea. Yngvi founded the sacred temple of Uppsala, a religious center of Nordic paganism. After his death, he continued to be revered as an incarnation of the god Frey, something that increased the fame of his descendants. The historical context of the legend of Ragnar Lodbrok began during the reign of the great Charlemagne, king of the Lombards, king of the Franks, and the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. During the reign of Charlemagne, Christianity expanded rapidly in Europe, reaching the Nordic lands of Scandinavia. where it was initially not well received by the population. The proud Nordics held to their beliefs. They believed in the ancient gods, and armed conflicts, motivated by religious differences, became more and more frequent. At that time, the famous Viking invasions began, which until then were simple attacks by small groups of Nordic looters. Frank sources cite the name of a Nordic king named Horik, who reigned in Denmark between 827 and his death in 854. His reign was marked by the attacks on the Carolingian Empire of Louis I, the son and successor of Charlemagne. Ragnar was a jarl in King Horik's court, with the right to command a certain number of warriors and own land in his name. Ragnar Lodbrok's first great achievement was motivated by a desire for revenge. Ragnar gathered his best warriors and led an invasion against a rival kingdom. This kingdom was ruled by a monarch who had the reputation of being cruel and abusive. Many years before, he had been responsible for killing Ragnar's grandfather. It was on this occasion that Ragnar met the squire Lagertha. Like other women, she was a prisoner in the fortress of the evil king. Ragnar freed the captive women and gave them weapons so that they could participate in the struggle. He was impressed by Lagertha's bravery. She fought with the same strength and determination as the men. After a difficult fight, Ragnar and Lagertha won, and Ragnar was deeply in love with the brave squire. Lagertha refused Ragnar's approaches, and even put a bear and a huge dog to protect the door of her house to keep the stubborn man away. But even that didn't stop Ragnar. With a spear, he killed the two guardian animals, gaining Lagertha's respect. Ragnar returned to his land with Lagertha at his side, where they married and formed a family. In several versions, Lagertha was forced to marry Ragnar. Ragnar and Lagertha had a son named Frøydleif and two daughters. However, the couple's relationship was troubled. The constant discussions led to a separation. Ragnar sought a new marriage that would help him raise his social status. For his new wife, he chose a young Swedish princess named Thora. But the princess's father was overprotective and always placed a monstrous poisonous snake as protector of Thora's chambers. It was there that the imaginative Ragnar created his famous wolfskin trousers. His tarred stitching was able to resist the attacks of the snake. Ragnar defeated the snake and won the right to marry Thora. He had two children with her. In some ancient writings, their names are Eric and Agnar. At that time, Ragnar Lodbrok became the leader of several Viking invasions, spreading his name and amassing impressive victories. Several historical records state that in the year 845, a large fleet of Viking ships attacked and devastated many villages in the French kingdom, then attacking Paris. This event became known as the Siege of Paris. According to chronicles written by the Franks, it was led by a man named Reginheri, a name that many historians consider to be the legendary Ragnar. Paris was surrounded, and after suffering many attacks, the city ended up defeated and looted by the Viking horde. Paris endured many Viking onslaughts over the years. One of the most famous was the Siege of 885, in which the famous Rollo, Duke of Normandy, participated. Despite everything, he had no parental relationship with Ragnar. In the first siege of Paris, Ragnar was a celebrity, known and respected among the Nordic people, but cursed and feared by his enemies. But fate would be cruel with Ragnar. His wife Thora died noticeably young, which left him devastated. Several years later, during one of his adventures, Ragnar met a beautiful young woman called Aslog, who initially presented herself as a simple peasant. But Aslog was the daughter of two great Nordic heroes, Siegfried, the famous warrior who slew the dragon Fafnir, and Brunhild, one of the Valkyries, daughters of the god Odin. Ragnar did not consider Aslog's privileged lineage strong enough. To test the woman's intelligence, he challenged her, where she would appear neither dressed nor naked, neither hungry nor satiated, and neither alone nor accompanied. Aslog appeared dressed in a fishing net, biting an onion and accompanied by a dog. Impressed by that strike of genius and seeing in her a wise companion, Ragnar asked her to marry him. With Aslog, Ragnar had 5 children: Bjorn Ironside, Hvitserk Whiteshirt, Haldfen, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ivar the Boneless. Even after 3 marriages, Ragnar could not resist other women. There are reports that he had relationships with several lovers, many of whom belonged to wealthy and influential families. One of these women, whose name is unknown, gave birth to another son, named Ubba Ragnarsson. About Ragnar's appearance, there is a passage written: "He was the greatest and the most beautiful of men that human eyes have ever seen." Perhaps this explains his success among women. Little is known about Ragnar's life after the siege of Paris. Some say he spent many years living like a true Viking, sailing off the coast of Ireland, Northumbria, and France, where he led new attacks on villages and cities. During Ragnar's absence, his children grew up to be respected warriors. Some even overcame their father's conquests. When Ragnar returned from his self-imposed exile, he was worried that his children were overcoming him. He began to fear a weak old age, where he would die forgotten in some lonely bed. To try to revive his name, Ragnar sought new supporters to lead a major attack against the kingdoms of England. The aim was to create permanent settlements and give new life to many Nordic settlers. But to his misfortune, few warriors volunteered for the journey. Ragnar left for England with only 2 warships. Ragnar wanted to land on the coast of the Kingdom of Mercia, but a major storm hit his boats, which sank in the turbulent waters. Ragnar survived the shipwreck and made it to the beach. Unfortunately, the storm led him to the Kingdom of Northumbria, where he was captured by soldiers of King Eil. Ragnar was a hated enemy, which had already caused many problems in Northumbria. Therefore, he was quickly sentenced to death. There is not much information on Ragnar's death. The most famous version says he was thrown into a well full of poisonous snakes. Ragnar may have died slowly, but he never begged for mercy, nor showed fear. He warned that his children would avenge his death. Coincidence or not, a few years after Ragnar's death, a great Viking army invaded the 4 kingdoms of England in what became known as the attack of the Great Heathen Army in 865. The leaders of that army claimed to be Ragnar's sons and would not rest until they avenged his father's death. Much of Ragnar Lodbrok's story is a combination of myth and reality. Many researchers say he is just a legendary figure. Others believe he was a real person whose history and achievements were exaggerated as his popularity grew. It is also possible that Ragnar was not just one person, but several personalities. As such, Ragnar is a literary character who aggregates the achievements of several Viking leaders. As for the renowned sons of Ragnar, many were proven historical figures, such as Bjorn Ironside, who sailed in the Mediterranean and sacked cities in southern Italy and Spain. Ubba Ragnarsson was a member of the Great Heathen Army, which conquered the city of York in Northumbria and the Kingdom of East Anglia. Ivar the Boneless was one of the most feared Viking leaders of his time, known for not forgiving his enemies. For a time, he was king on the territory of Ireland. The stories about Ragnar Lodbrok may or may not be true, but his influence on Viking culture is undeniable. Nowadays, his legend continues to captivate us and awaken our admiration.
The Vikings left their mark on history as invaders and cruel plunderers, but they were also bold warriors, fearless explorers, and great navigators. During their incursions against other territories, the Viking warriors were led by warlords known as earls, whose number of responsibility was to choose the targets to be attacked, to ensure good in the army, and to split the plundered goods of the cities and villages. Generally speaking, most Viking captains were happy to attack merchant ships or coastal villages, getting back to their homeland with wealth and slaves. But some wanted more than ephemeral riches. They dreamed of conquering land for cultivation and animal husbandry, with the intent to establish permanent settlements. One of the most successful leaders of the Viking era was Rollo. later known as Rollo of Normandy. Rollo's birthplace is still a subject of discussion among researchers, varying between Denmark and Norway, around the year 860 AD. The details of Rollo's youth are still obscure, and many of his accomplishments have a semi-legendary portrait, like that of the famous Ragnar Lothbrok. Sources suggest that Rollo was a member of a noble lineage, having received proper training in fighting and commanding warriors in battle. Rollo soon became a promising and ambitious warlord, leading invasions in the region of the western frontier, where France is today. At the time, it was ruled by the Kingdom of the Franks. The first invasions in France were unsuccessful. The Vikings lost and were expelled, but they would not be kept away for long. A few years later, they returned with a large army which attacked the city of Rouen, leaving it in ruins. Ancient writings tell that Rollo engaged and commanded Viking invasions between 876 and 886 against Paris, a remarkable achievement since Paris was a formidable city with high walls and reinforced gates. Paris had been built on a portion of land surrounded by the river Seine. It would have taken more than 100 Viking ships to surround the city. Seeking to appease the situation with the Viking invaders while protecting his kingdom from certain destruction, King Charles III of France, also known as Charles the Simple, started to pay an increasing amount of silver to persuade the Nordic leaders not to attack his territory. Rollo was one of the leaders who accepted the tributes and even developed a close relationship with King Charles. Rollo received the valuable proposal to take over land in France, where he could bring in other Nordic settlers and start a new life on more fertile land. The condition for this agreement was that Rollo and his warriors would have to protect the kingdom of the West Francia against attacks by other Viking lords. This sort of proposal was common at the time, and many Viking captains accepted it without much resistance. However, as soon as they received the payment, they went back to their ships and set sail in search of new targets to attack or extort. But Rollo respected his commitment to King Charles and stood firm in defending his lands, taking part in important battles and defeating his former Viking fellows. As a reward for his loyalty, King Charles offered his daughter, Princess Gisela, to marry Rollo. But the marriage cost something, and Rollo had to agree to be baptized and convert to Christianity. With that, he would be tied to the royal family and the Frank kingdom. With the marriage now officialized, Rollo finally received, in 911, the right to the Promised Lands. And, as in the ancient French language, the Nordic were now called Normans. This territory became known as Normandy, the land of the northern men, whose capital was the reconstructed city of Rouen. Although Rollo is known as the Duke of Normandy, there are no contemporary records that he has received this title in his lifetime. The fact is that, after Rollo took command of Normandy, there were no further attempts at Viking invasions in the region, proving the great military ability of its new inhabitants. Rollo's influence kept growing in the royal court. New Nordic settlers arrived in Normandy, expanding its borders. Even after Rollo's death in 930, his descendants continued to rule over Normandy for many generations to come. His great-great-great-great-grandson, William I, conquered England in 1066, becoming the first Norman king of England. Rollo's life can be regarded as a success story. He managed to triumph where many failed, preferring to build a future for his people rather than seeking chaos and destruction. Bjorn Ironside was a legendary Swedish king who is said to have reigned during the 9th century. He is believed to be the first leader of the Munso dynasty, a Scandinavian royal house whose first members were considered legendary. According to the 12th and 13th century Scandinavian stories, Bjorn was the son of the notorious Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok. However, contrary to how he was portrayed in the History Channel's Vikings television series, his mother was not the famous squire Lagertha, but rather Princess Aslaug, Ragnar's third wife. Bjorn had 3 brothers. The eldest was Ivar the Boneless, with 2 younger brothers, Hvisert and Sigurd. There were also 3 half-brothers, Agnar, Eric, and Friedleif, Ragnar's sons with his first 2 wives. In the tale of Ragnar Lothbrok, Bjorn Ironside and his brothers continued the invasion started by their father and terrorized the areas of England, Normandy, France, and Lombardy. Historical records indicate Ivar as the leader of the band of brothers, while Bjorn was described as a capable and fierce warrior, able to change the course of battles. Bjorn was given the epithet Ironside, possibly in a reference to the strength of his arms or back muscles, which were compared to that of iron. Another explanation for this name was a mystical protection that guaranteed the physical integrity of Bjorn's hindquarters during battles. According to historical accounts, Bjorn, accompanied by the Viking lord Hastein, supposedly a friend of Ragnar Lothbrok, invaded southern France and headed for the Mediterranean. After entering the Spanish coastal regions, they proceeded to the city of Pisa, Italy. But they could make no further progress when they reached the gates of the city of Luni, which they thought was Rome. They eventually conquered Luni in one of Bjorn Ironside's most significant achievements. He managed to capture the city using his wits, a feature that made him one of the most famous Vikings in history. Having trouble getting past the Luni walls, Bjorn thought of a clever way to enter the city. He sent men to inform the city bishop of his own death, but that, before he died, he had converted to Christianity and wanted to be buried in consecrated ground. The city allowed his body to be brought in by a small group of guards who secretly carried weapons under their robes. After entering the church, Bjorn suddenly emerged from the coffin, surprising everyone. Besides the warriors, he advanced to the city gates. He opened them, and his army entered to capture Luni. After sacking Luni, Bjorn and the Viking fleet invaded Sicily and the North African coasts. On their return home, they encountered the navy forces of Al-Andalus, strong Islamic rulers of the Iberian Peninsula. It was an unfortunate episode for Bjorn and his men, for they were hit by a weapon much feared at the time, the Greek fire, capable of igniting a wooden ship and burning even on the water's surface. Bjorn's fleet lost 40 warships, and the survivors were forced to retreat. The tale of Ragnar Lothbrok states that, after the enormous success of his sons Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironside in the many raids in Europe and the Mediterranean Sea, Ragnar became jealous, not wanting them to rule Sweden in his place. Ragnar chose a man named Eystein Belli as the replacement king of Sweden, and, with only a small contingent of ships and warriors, decided to invade the kingdom of Northumbria and defeat his longtime enemy, King Ela. Ragnar was captured by King Ela of Northumbria and ended up dead in a pit full of snakes. Ragnar's sons decided to avenge their father by sailing to England. They formed the Great Heathen Army and brutally savaged the Saxon kingdoms. The Viking forces invaded Northumbria and captured King Ela alive. He was tortured by Ragnar's sons and subjected to a cruel death in a ritual known as the Blood Eagle. Ragnar's inheritance was divided between the brothers, and Bjorn received the city of Uppsala in Sweden and all the lands therein. Alongside his younger brothers Sigurd and Hivisurk, Bjorn spent much time raiding and pillaging France before returning to his newly acquired kingdom. Bjorn had two sons, Refel and Erik Bjornsson. The latter would become the king of Sweden after Bjorn's death. Bjorn founded the House of Munso, known as the Old Dynasty, which ruled Sweden for many generations. However, they were eventually driven out of Sweden after an extended period of civil war in the late 10th century. In the 18th century, a tomb was discovered on the island of Munso, and many scholars claimed it to belong to the legendary Viking king Bjorn Ironside. Ivar the Boneless, also known as Ivar Ragnarsson, was one of the most famous warlords of the Viking Age. His reputation is evident in the Old Norse legends, where he is revered as a divine warrior. In contrast, British sources of the time considered him a demon from the depths of hell. The Norse sagas say that Ivar was the son of the famous Viking warrior Ragnar Lothbrok and his wife, Aslog. There are many theories about the origin of the epithet the Boneless. This term may indicate some of Ivar's physical handicap, evident from his birth. It is believed that Ivar had weak and brittle bones, or even no bones in his legs. Some historians believe that Ivar was impotent. The fact that he never married and had children may explain the nickname. According to the beliefs of the time, this deformity was the result of a curse. Ivar's mother, Aslog, known as a powerful seer, warned Ragnar that he was expected to wait 3 days before consummating his marriage. The gods would not be pleased if the couple rushed the wedding night. Ragnar ignored the warning, and Ivar was born with legs whose structures were similar to cartilage rather than bone. Because of his disability, Ivar had to be carried by his guardians on a stretcher or shield. Despite this inconvenient problem, Ivar had a great talent for planning and strategy, as well as being a skilled archer. Ivar had 3 younger brothers, who became his main battle companions: Bjorn Ironside, Hiesturk, and Sigurd, all of them brave warriors. They often participated in raids together, where they were led by Ivar. The brothers rarely made strategic decisions without consulting him. Ivar was a born leader and loyal to his family. He was dismayed by the news that his father, King Ragnar Lothbrok, had been captured and executed by King Alla of Northumbria. Ivar demanded to know all the details of his father's death, who was thrown into a pit of poisonous vipers. The unfortunate circumstances of Ragnar's death fueled Ivar's hatred, and he began to plan his revenge against the Saxons. Ivar devised a cunning plan. He traveled to England, where he formally met with King Alla. To humiliate Ivar, Alla agreed to compensate him for his father's death by promising him a portion of land whose size could be covered with the largest cowhide available. So Ivar stretched a cowhide and cut it into thin strips, covering a much larger territory than intended. Due to his cunning, Ivar got a territory large enough to found the city of York, which would become one of the most important English cities of the Middle Ages. Ivar devoted himself to establishing local connections with other Viking leaders and Saxon lords dissatisfied with the King Alla. With new allies, Ivar asked his brothers to join him in his plan for revenge. The forces gathered by Ivar became known as the Great Heathen Army, which launched a wave of Viking invasions and conquest against the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms over 14 years. Ivar's army eventually defeated the Northumbrian forces and King Alla was captured alive. Ivar was ruthless when it came to punishing the man who had ordered his father's death. King Alla was sacrificed in a dreaded pagan ritual, the Blood Eagle. The victim's ribcage was opened from the back and his lungs removed. Ivar also threw salt into Alla's wounds, increasing his agony in the final moments of life. Little is known about Ivar's life after he consummated his revenge. Some historical sources say that a Viking leader named Eymar terrorized the northern Irish Sea during the 9th century. Eymar was the Old Irish adaptation of the name Ivar. This suggests that the legendary Viking leader attacked Ireland and had some relation to the nobility of that territory. And yes, after that time, the Dublin and York dynasties were closely linked. The most accepted theory is that Ivar remained king of York after avenging the death of his father. According to some Irish chronicles, Ivar died around the year 873, a victim of a sudden and horrible illness. In 1686, a farm worker discovered a Scandinavian tomb in Repton, England, near a site where the great pagan army defeated King Burgred of Mercia. The number of skeletons around the main tomb indicated that the man buried there had a very high status. It is said that this tomb is possibly Ivar the Boneless's last resting place.
From 793 to 1066 AD, the Viking Age was a period in the Middle Ages characterized by the numerous raids by Norse warriors known as Vikings, who undertook large-scale raids, piracy, colonization, conquest, and trade throughout Europe. Although they were mostly famous for their bravery as warriors, the Vikings were also accomplished sailors and explorers. There are many Norse sagas telling of the military conquests of powerful kings and warlords, who led raids against European kingdoms. The Norse sagas also tell of the adventures of several heroes and explorers who blazed the oceans in search of new lands to colonize. Perhaps the most successful Norse explorer of the Middle Ages was Leif Erikson. He was also called by Leif the Lucky, the son of the infamous Viking Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Erik the Red, an explorer and the founder of the first Norse settlement in Greenland. Erik was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, along with his family and slaves. Upon finding a habitable area and settling there, he named it Greenland, which in a free translation means green earth, purportedly in the hope that the new pleasant name would attract new settlers. Leif Erikson is not known for certain whether he was born in Iceland or Greenland, since his birthplace was not chronicled in the sagas. There are few details about his youth. but it is reported that Leif served for a time in the court of Olaf Tryggvason, king of Norway, from 995 to 1000 AD. By then, Christianity had already gained a lot of ground among the Nordic peoples, and many people in Scandinavia adopted the Christian faith. Leif was converted to Christianity while at the court of King Olaf. Once converted, Leif was charged with returning to Greenland together with a Christian priest to convert the settlers there, but he did not expect that he was about to experience the greatest adventure of his life, which would go down in history as the Vinland Sagas. During this saga, Leif met a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who claimed to have found unknown lands after he and his crew were knocked off course while sailing to Greenland. Believing it to be a dangerous place, they did not disembark, but rather sailed back east and eventually made it to Greenland, where they reported their discovery to the colonists. Leif eventually approached Bjarni, bought his ship, assembled a crew of 35 men, and mounted an expedition headed for the land that the sailor had described. Leif pursued the route indicated by Bjarni, and landed first at a rocky and desolate place that he called Helluland, the land of flat rock, possibly Baffin Island, Canada's largest. After he adventured further by sea, he landed a second time in a wooded place which he called Markland, the land of the forest. After 2 more days at sea, he landed on an island to the north and then headed back to the mainland. They sailed west and landed in a green area with a mild climate and plentiful salmon stocks. Leif decided to make camp there and sent groups to explore the country as winter approached. While on one of these explorations, they discovered that the land was full of vineyards and wild grapes. Leif therefore called the land Vinland, the land of vineyards. He and his team built a small settlement there, becoming the first Europeans to settle in North America. Leif's breakthrough is considered one of the greatest feats in history, as it occurred almost 500 years before the voyages of Christopher Columbus and John Cabot. The territory that was called Vinland depicts the island called Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the northeast of New Brunswick, regions located on the Labrador Peninsula in Canada. In the early 1960s, research by Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife identified a Norse site located on the northern tip of Newfoundland, proving the veracity of the Norse text about Leif Erikson's voyage. A location known as Lians Ox Meadows was suggested to be the original settlement of Vinland, but further archaeological evidence suggests that these buildings were actually a ship repair station and waypoint for travelers. There were no permanent Norse settlements in North America over the centuries, but knowledge of voyages to Vinland spread throughout medieval Europe. It has been suggested that knowledge of Vinland's location may have been held in European seaports in the 15th century. Christopher Columbus claimed in a letter to have visited Iceland in 1477, where he may have heard stories about this place. Leif, after spending the winter in Vinland, returned to Greenland in the spring with a cargo of grapes and wood. On the return trip, he rescued an Icelandic castaway and his crew, earning him the nickname Leif the Lucky. Leif, for unknown reasons, never returned to Vinland, but other explorers from Greenland and Iceland followed his instructions to venture into the newly discovered land. Leif Eriksson's name is mentioned in a deed for the last time in 1019. He passed his title as the head of his family to his son, Thorkel, in 1025. Nothing is mentioned about his death in the sagas, but he probably died of old age in Greenland. On October 6, 2000, U.S. President Bill Clinton issued Presidential Proclamation 7358, proclaiming Monday, October 9, 2000 as Leif Erikson Day. There have only been 2 kings in the English history who have been given the title the Great. One of them was King Alfred of Wessex, responsible for fighting off many Viking invasions and starting the unification of England. The second was a Dane named Canute, who was King of England, Denmark, and Norway during his lifetime. Canute was the son of Svein Forkbeard, King of Denmark, until 1014. Not much is known about Canute's childhood and youth. He was under 20 when he followed his father on the successful invasion of England in August of 1013. Canute is described in the Norse sagas as a man exceptionally tall, strong, and good-looking, except for his nose, which was thin and quite hooked. He had a fair complexion and a fine thick hair. His eyes were nicer than those of other men, both more beautiful and sharper. This description is from the Knut Linga saga. As King Svein was conquering England, Canute was put in charge of the Danish army. After his father's abrupt death, Canute was crowned king by the Danish army. Nevertheless, the assembly of English noblemen refused to accept him and instead voted to reinstate the previous king, Ethelred, who had been defeated by Svein. and was exiled to Normandy to the English throne. 2 years later, upon Ethelred's death, Canute became the sole king of England in 1016. In the meantime, his brother King Harold II of Denmark eventually died in 1018, and Canute was also crowned King of Denmark. When the young Canute assumed the English and Danish throne, very few could have predicted that he would become one of the most successful kings of the early medieval period, ruling a Scandinavian empire that spanned the entire North Sea. To connect his lineage with the English dynasty and to protect himself against Normandy attacks, Canute married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, daughter of Richard, the Duke of Normandy. As the King of England, Canute blended institutions and ruled the English and Danish people as equals. By partitioning the country into the 4 great counties of Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, he established the system of territorial lordships that would anchor English rule for centuries to come. Throughout his early reign, Canute was a stern ruler and resorted to executions and exile to keep his precarious positions as king of the North Sea Empire. Canute planned the murder of Edmund Ironside's brother, hunted Edmund's sons out of England to Hungary, and ordered the killing of many of his notable English rivals. After 7 years, when his government grew more stable, he adopted a less harsh policy and allowed more Saxons to hold positions of power. In 1028, Canute conquered Norway with a 50-ship fleet from England, taking power as ruler of a massive empire around the North Sea. Canute converted to Christianity and was an eager patron of the church. He sponsored leaders of the English church and was recognized by the Pope as the first Viking to become a Christian king. Setting sail on a pilgrimage to Rome, Canute showed both reverence and humility. Upon his return to England, he promised his Saxon subjects that he would rule with mercy and justice. Canute ruled England for 19 years. His protection against Viking invaders helped restore England's prosperity, and the resources he controlled helped him to establish a firm hold on Scandinavia as well. After attacks in Scotland, Malcolm II, King of Scots, recognized Canute as a suzerain, and peace with Scotland was settled for the remainder of Canute's reign. The great Anglo-Saxon king Canute died on November 12, 1035, at Shaftesbury in Dorset, being buried at Winchester. Upon his death, Canute was succeeded in Denmark by his son, Harthacnut, also known as Canute III. One of his other sons, named Harold Harefoot, came to power in England, ruling until his death in 1040. This ends the story of the greatest Viking king to rule in England. Harald Hardrada was king of Norway from 1046 to 1066. However, even before he became king, Harald's life was packed with challenges and adventures that made him known throughout the medieval era. He remains relevant to this day and is one of the main characters in the Netflix TV series Vikings Valhalla. Born in 1015, Harald was the son of Sigurd Sur, the lord of some country lands in Ringerike, Norway. His baptismal name was Harald Sigurdsson, but he came to be called by the epithet Hardrada, meaning the strict ruler, referring to the toughness and firmness with which he governed and dealt with the noblemen, landlords, and clergy members. Harald was a half-brother of Olaf, who was later to become Saint Olaf. Harald and Olaf's parents are thought to be descended from Harald Fairhair, Norway's legendary first king, who unified all the rival fiefdoms through alliances and military force. Harald greatly admired his half-brother Olaf, who managed to control more of Norway in a few short years than anyone since Harald Fairhair. As the Norse sagas go, Olaf assembled an army to fight a rival lord who had stirred up a rebellion. The clash took place at the so-called Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Only 15 years old, Harald took part in this battle, which did not go well for the two half-brothers. Olaf was killed, but Harald managed to escape. Even though Harald was beaten, he did extremely well in battle, showing considerable talent for his young age. Aware that he would be chased by his enemies, Harald fled to Russia, where he was warmly welcomed by the Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise and his wife Ingegard, who was a Swedish princess and Harald's distant cousin. Most likely, Harald took part in fighting against enemies of the Russian royalty, including the Poles, Byzantines, and some steppe tribes. After helping Yaroslav for a few years, Harald and his men departed to travel farther south. Around 1034, Harald and his men reached Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Norse called Constantinople by the name of Miklagard, a word that can be translated as Great Fortress. They joined the Varangian Guard, which consisted of elite warriors from Northern Europe and Britain to protect the Byzantine emperor. Harold was extremely popular with the Emperor Michael IV, soon becoming the leader of the Varangian Guard. Serving the emperor, Harold fought from the Mediterranean to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and it is reported that he made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. His military prowess was chronicled by medieval Byzantine and Norse historians. Sadly for Harold, Michael IV passed away and was succeeded by his nephew, Michael V, who mistrusted the Norse warrior and ordered him arrested. Harold was in prison, but somehow managed to escape and took a ship back north. Back in Russia, Harold was still a young man, but he was now wealthy and experienced enough to be highly respected by the nobility. Harold married the daughter of Grand Prince Yaroslav, Elizabeth. Harold allegedly asked to marry her on his maiden visit to Russia when she would have been about 14 years old, but the request was declined because he was not wealthy enough at the time. Now having the marriage made official, Harold joined prominent European royalty members such as Henry I of France and Andrew I of Hungary. Not long after Harold arrived in Russia, Yaroslav raided Constantinople by sea. Arguably, Harold may have provided information about the city's military defenses. Nevertheless, the Russians were overwhelmed by the Great Walls of Constantinople and withdrew to their own lands. When Harold came back to Norway in 1045, he consented to share the Norwegian throne with his reigning king, his nephew, Magnus Olafsson I. When Magnus died in 1047 in a military raid against Denmark, Harold ascended to his rightful place as the sole king of Norway. He had spent the next 15 years trying to snatch the Danish throne from Sweyn II. After Sweyn's defeat at the Battle of Nis in 1062, both rulers acknowledged each other as sovereigns of their own countries. Harold expanded Norway's colonial dominions in the Orkney, Shetland, and Hebridean Islands. In 1066, he attempted to conquer England by allying with the rebellious Earl Tostig against the new English King Harold II. After securing initial victories, Harold's troops were defeated by the English king in September 1066 at the infamous Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold was slaughtered after an arrow pierced his throat. The remaining of his men fought on, but were ultimately defeated. This ends the story of the last Viking king, whose life was packed with sea voyages, far-flung land adventures, military glory, and political conspiracies, finding his demise on the battlefield as a true hero worthy of being called to Valhalla.
During the historical period known as the Viking Age, many men risked their lives fighting on shield walls. Some fought for reputation or wealth, others fought to defend their homes and families. Such conflicts gave rise to the many stories that cherish the bravery and military achievements of kings and warriors. But war is not exclusively conducted by men, nor was sheer strength was the only requirement to win battles. In some ancient peoples, like the Celts and the Germanic, it was not unusual to see women in battles, and some had the reputation of being braver and more skillful warriors than many men. Nevertheless, with the arrival of Christianity in Europe and the development of more civilized societies, women were more diminished to less important roles, limited to looking after their children and domestic chores. But for the people living in the distant lands of Scandinavia, life was still the same as many generations ago. Women still had some autonomy and rights in society. Norse women retained the right to choose their husbands, except in cases of political marriages, which could be arranged for greater benefit to the kingdom. Women also had the right to own land in their name and slaves to work on their farms. In Norse culture, it was common and well accepted that women learned to fight. After all, they needed to defend themselves and their homes, especially while men were fishing on the high seas or participating in invasions in distant lands. In the eyes of other contemporary peoples, the freedom guaranteed to Norse women was seen as something retrograde and often unacceptable. Some women, however, were not happy to lead a simple life, in small homes where they raised children and some rural animals. These brave women gave up their dresses and jewels and took up arms, becoming professional warriors who came to be called skaldmol, the shield maidens. Proving their name, most female warriors fought with shields, swords, and small axes. The use of spears was also common, as the length of this weapon allowed the warrior to attack her enemies while remaining at a safe distance. There is little historical evidence about the participation of women in Viking invasions, but many legends and poems talk about warriors who fought side by side with men on shield walls. One of the most renowned shield maidens was Lagertha, whose story was written by the historian Saxo Grammaticus. The story claims that Lagertha was captured by an abusive king, who kept in his domains other women kidnapped from several neighboring kingdoms. When the famous Ragnar Lodbrok arrived with his group of warriors to fight the tyrant king, Lagertha and her companion managed to escape from their captivity and went to Ragnar's camp. Ragnar was impressed by Lagertha's ferocity and will, and handed weapons to the women so they could partake in the battle. With the support of the female warriors, the sordid king was defeated, and Lagertha became Ragnar Lodbrok's wife. Another famous shield maiden in the Norse sagas was Brunhild, who had an important role in the Nibelungenlied. According to legend, Brunhild was a Valkyrie, daughter of Odin, albeit condemned to live like a mortal after having disagreed with her father. Brunhild would marry the legendary hero Siegfried, with whom she had a daughter named Aslog. Most of the women who accompanied the Vikings in their adventures were not warriors. But with the breakthroughs in archaeology, evidence brought to light the existence of the famous shield maidens. A tomb found in 1880 in Sweden had the skeleton of a young woman around the age of 20. Near the skeleton were parts of some weapons, such as axes, spears, and a sword, revealing that this was the resting place of a warrior. Today, women continue to prove to the world that they are far from fragile, keeping alive the courage and pride of the ancient Norse warriors.
In the beginning of everything, there was a huge void known as Ginnungagap between the fire realm of Muspelheim and Niflheim, the icy land of mists. The freezing mists of Niflheim began to fill the Ginnungagap void and formed a great block of ice. As the temperature in Muspelheim began to rise, the heat from the fire started to melt the great ice stone. From within the ice emerged Ymir, a primitive deity who had hibernated within the ice. After the thawing, Ymir continued to sleep, but the heat of Muspelheim caused the colossal creature to sweat. From the sweat emerged the first living creatures. It was not only Ymir that emerged after the melting of the ice. A great cow named Arhumla also emerged. From her teats flowed 4 rivers that fed Ymir. The cow fed herself by licking a block of salty ice, and, as the ice was consumed, a new creature emerged. This being was Buri, the progenitor of the gods. While Ymir slept, he continued to generate life, giving rise to the Jotun. Buri united with a giant to give birth to Bor. Bor joined with the giant Besla to give birth to Odin, Vili, and Ve. Odin and his brothers lived frustrated and bored in the emptiness of Ginnungagap, as there was no sky, land, sea, or forests yet. The brothers decided that something had to be done. Only the death of Ymir could start the world we know today. Odin, Vile, and Ve attacked and killed the giant Ymir. From her blood the oceans were born. From Ymir's flesh grew dry land, and her great bones were piled up, giving rise to the mountain ranges. In Ymir's flesh were small larvae. From them emerged the dwarves, who were to live beneath the earth, and the noble elves, who were to reside in Elfhelheim. After shaping Midgard, the gods thought that this could not be an uninhabited realm. Seeing 2 logs at the edge of the ocean, they decided that they would use that material to create mankind. A man known as Ask and a woman named Embla were shaped. Odin gave them life, Vili gave them intelligence, and Ve carved their eyes, ears, and mouths. With these, the men would be able to hear, see, and speak. All humans are descended from this first couple. Because he gave life to the first couple, Odin is known as the father of all. Finally, the brothers created the kingdom of Asgard, the home of the gods. This realm was separate from the others, connected only by the Bifrost Bridge. This was the beginning of the reign of the gods over the world. After creating the world on the body of the giant Ymir, who had been killed by the Aesir gods, Odin went on to reign over the world atop his throne in Asgard. Even though he was a wise god, he was aware that he did not know everything. So he set out on an adventure in search of knowledge. He disguised himself as a wanderer and walked through Jotunheim, the land of giants and enemies of the gods. In this realm lived Mimir, a very ancient deity and uncle of Odin. He lived near the Well of Knowledge. The waters of this well were responsible for feeding Yggdrasil, the Tree of Worlds. Mimir, using the Gjallarhorn horn, drank sacred water, and his knowledge of the world increased. Odin went to his uncle's well and asked him to drink the water of knowledge. "Mimir, I'm your nephew and lord of the gods, but how can I be worthy of my title without true wisdom? Being my kinsman or lord of the gods does not give you the right to drink from my well. The price is much higher than you can imagine." "Tell me the price. I'm willing to pay it." "The price is your eye. I want you to pluck it out and throw it into the well. Only then will you be able to drink the water from the Well of Knowledge." Odin knew that Mimir did not tell jokes. He would have to pay a high price if he were to attain true wisdom. The great god did not flinch and gouged out his own eye. His cry of pain was so loud that it echoed throughout the universe. Odin deposited his eye in the waters of the well, and this sacrifice satisfied Mimir. He offered him a horn with the water from his well, and he asked the god to drink the entire contents at once. After drinking the entire contents of the container, the father of all was filled with knowledge. A large scar filled the void where his eye had previously been, which at times emitted a brightly glowing flame. Odin came to be known as the One-Eyed Man, or the One with the Flaming Eye. Odin began to see the world much more clearly. With only one eye, he could see better than when he had two. Odin, the One-Eyed God, reigned on his throne in Asgard, the realm of the Aesir gods. His court had other deities, which further increased the prestige of Odin's kingdom. But another kingdom was also extremely prestigious among men: Vanaheim, the land of the Vanir gods. These competed with the Asgardians for the worship of mortals. Both kingdoms coexisted, but always with tension between them. The gods of Asgard descended from Vili, Ve, and Odin, who in the early days defeated the giant Ymir. The origin of the Vanir was unknown. Besides Odin, Thor and Loki were the most prominent deities in Asgard. In Vanaheim, the highlights were Frey, Freya, and Njord. The Asgardians were deities connected with power and war, while the Vanir were gods of fertility. There was Gulveig, a strong sorceress known for her greed and love of gold. The gods of Asgard found her unbearable and tried 3 times to burn the witch, but she always returned. But the sorceress was an ally of the Vanir gods, who were outraged by the way the Asgardians treated their protege. The precarious peace between Vanir and Aesir ended, and the first great war between gods broke out. Odin threw his powerful spear at the Vanir. It was a sign that this would not be a simple disagreement, but a battle that could decide the fate of the world. No other war would be as important until Ragnarok. The Vanir gods would eventually march against Asgard, bringing down part of the mighty wall erected by the giant builder. The conflict between the gods made the world tremble. Both sides showed their worth, fighting with great courage. Neither side was able to overthrow the other, and the devastation of the war worried both sides. The war could last for millennia, and if one side were to win, it would rain only on ashes, for nothing would be left after such a massive conflict.
Therefore, the authorities on both sides decided to seal the peace between the two peoples. To ensure goodwill, an exchange of hostages took place. The Asgardian gods Mimir and Honir would move to Vanaheim, while Frey, Freya, and Njord would move to Asgard. The two gods who came to live in Vanaheim were described as great sages, but in fact only Mimir was endowed with wisdom. Honir pretended to be wise, but only repeated what Mimir whispered in his ear. The Vanir noticed that when Honir was consulted about some issue and Mimir was not around, he would always reply, "Let the others decide." Realizing that they had been deceived and that Mimir was complicit in that plan, the Vanir gods cut off their heads and returned them to Odin. The father of all did not want to lose Mimir's wisdom and used his powers to resurrect the head. Mimir was revived, and Odin began to consult the sage's head when he needed his precious advice. A new peace agreement was sealed between Vanir and Aesir, and the two peoples began to live in harmony. The Vanir gods were placed on the Norse pantheon alongside the Aesir. Thus, gods such as Frey and Freya came to be admired as other great Aesir gods.
Sif, the goddess and wife of the mighty Thor, had beautiful and long golden hair, and from all the goddess's traits, her hair was the one that attracted the thunder god the most. But one day, Thor woke up and was faced with a bald woman in his bed and yelled,
"Who are you, witch? And what have you done with my beloved Sif?"
The god, stunned, recognized his wife and shouted, "Loki!" The scream was heard throughout the whole kingdom of Asgard. During the night, Loki, the god of mischief, concocted yet another of his pranks. While the goddess was sleeping, he cut her beautiful hair. The thunder god dragged Loki up to his room, where Sif cried copiously,
"Look at what you have done! How did you dare to cut my wife's hair? What now? Do I have to parade with a bald wife right by my side?"
"Have you ever thought about the possibility of making her wear a hat?" Thor lifted Loki from the floor and said,
"If you do not find a way to make my Sif regain her splendor, I will break every single one of your bones."
Considering that threat, the god of mischief started to think of a way to solve that situation, until he had an idea. So he departed towards Svartalheim, the dwarf land. He was aware that the skillful dwarves were able to do anything, but before that, he would have to convince them. Then he looked for the brothers, sons of Ivaldi, who were skillful craftsmen, and said, "You don't know the latest news. The gods will conduct a trial to establish who the best craftsmen are. And the brothers Brock and Eitri said that you, sons of Ivaldi, do not have the slightest chance."
"That's an outrage. Those pierced, clumsy hands will not have the slightest chance against us."
"Very well, but there is one condition. You have to do 3 gifts for the gods, and one of them has to be a long golden hair that never stops growing." Loki departed to incite the brothers Brock and Eitri to establish a competition. You will not believe this. The sons of Ivaldi will participate in a contest promoted by the gods to decide who the best craftsmen are, and they said you don't have any chance, given that you are nothing but a bunch of clumsy guys.
"Clumsy guys? Huh. That's quite typical of the sons of Ivaldi, but we will not compete. Everybody already knows that we are much better, so we have nothing to gain."
"I bet that you are not better than the legendary brothers Ivaldison. I would bet my own head on it."
"The head of the most elusive of gods seems a nice prize to me. I accept the bet."
Loki trembled, but did not step back and accepted the bet. He also knew that Brock and Eitri were better than the sons of Ivaldi, but now he would have to use all of his cunning talents to untangle himself from that mess. The dwarves, sons of Ivaldi, started to make their gifts for the gods, and Loki noticed that everything seemed to went well. But the god realized that the other pair was doing something outstanding. Loki then understood he had to intervene. Brock and Eitri had already built 2 beautiful gifts, but they were certainly crafting the greatest of all works. It was a powerful hammer. To achieve perfection, the dwarves had to keep the forge at an ideal temperature, not a degree more or less. And Brock did his work by pumping the bellows with great precision. Loki noticed he had to act quickly and turned himself into a large hematophagous mosquito. He flew to Brock and painfully stung his hand. The dwarf withstood the pain and continued his work. Then Loki attacked with an even stronger sting in his neck. The dwarf unleashed painful cries but resisted. The god then decided to attack the dwarf's eyes. He closed his eyes, and the eyelids were attacked. The agony was unbearable, and the dwarf stopped pumping the bellows. Due to the temperature change, the hammer's handle broke. Loki considered his mission accomplished and went away. The time for the great clash had arrived, and the dwarves, sons of Ivaldi, presented their gifts to the gods. The goddess Sif, wife of Thor, was gifted with new hair made of gold. Seeing the goddess with her splendor back, Loki felt some relief. Odin was gifted a beautiful and powerful spear, capable of piercing anything, and every oath made under that spear would be unbreakable. Frey was given a huge boat, which could be folded so many times to the point where it could fit into a pocket. Those were 3 impressive gifts, much to Loki's relief. The turn of Brock and Eitri had come. The latter still had puffy eyes because of the sting. He gave bracelets made of Draupnir gold to Odin, a material from which, every 8 nights, new bracelets would fall from it like drops. These could serve as honorary ornaments or a way to increase wealth. Frey was given a huge boar with golden fur, which could be mounted. The creature could fly and never be tired, and his shine drove the darkness away. And Thor's time finally arrived, and he was given a hammer.
This is a beautiful hammer, but its handle is too short. I understand your disappointment, but don't judge this hammer by its handle. Its name is Mjolnir. It is indestructible, and its power is almost indescribable. When thrown, it never misses its target and always comes back to its owner. Such a marvelous piece! With this powerful hammer, no giant will be a match for me.
Odin, Thor, and Frey agreed that, from all those gifts, the Mjolnir hammer was certainly the best. Despite all the tricks, Loki's plan collapsed, and now his head was demanded as a prize.
Ha 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 ha! Now I want your head,
Brokey said, already sharpening his axe. But Loki had one last play. You can sever my head, as long as you do not damage a single piece of my neck. The agreement says that you can only have my head.
You cheater! How will I get your head without damaging the neck?
Then Odin intervened.
If people paid more attention to the words used, they would never negotiate with the cunning Loki, the trickster god.
Brokey, to punish Loki, sewed his mouth so that he would never deceive anyone again for a long time. But at least the cheater kept his head on his neck. And the gods of Asgard received magnificent artifacts. The gods Thor and Loki crossed the world in Thor's chariot, which was pulled by powerful goats. The gods had left for the kingdom of the giants, looking for taking part in new adventures. Before that, they stopped in a humble house, where the gods wanted to stay for the night. The gods were warmly welcomed by the villagers, but being poor, they had nothing to offer as food. Thor told them not to worry, because he would provide a bountiful meal. The god himself slaughtered his own goats and had their meat prepared for a meal that would honor any god. The god of thunder offered food to the dwellers who welcomed him, and then he said,
"You can eat as much as you want. I only ask you to leave the bones unscathed."
While everyone ate the delicious goat meat, Loki decided to do one of his pranks. He approached the hut's young resident, known as Tjalfi, and he told him, "There is no fairness at all in allowing Thor to keep all the delicious marrow which fill these bones just for himself. Such a delicacy would give great strength to those who eat it. The boy now wanted to try it. He waited until everyone was asleep and broke one of the bones to taste the marrow. The bones were then thrown over the skin of the slaughtered goats. The next day, Thor did a ritual and brought the goats back to life. However, one of the goats was now limping because its leg had been broken. Thor was enraged and grabbed his powerful hammer. "You bastards! I offered you plenty of food and just got betrayal as a return. Who did this?" Loki tried to conceal his smile. Tjalfi, regretting his action, confessed the crime. "Just give me one reason why I shouldn't destroy this house, together with those who live in it."
"Spare my family. They did nothing. Take me as your servant, so that I may pay my debt to the gods."
Thor was benevolent and decided to spare Tjalfi's family, and they now would have to treat his goats. While Thor, Loki, and Tjalfi departed to explore the land of the giants. Thor, Loki, and his new servant Tjalfi roamed through the inhospitable kingdom of Jotunheimer, the land of the giants. The intense cold forced them to look for shelter. The gods found what appeared to be a huge cave and they went inside. The travelers tried to rest, but an immense noise trembled the earth. Thor stepped out of the cave to investigate the source and, from the top of a mountain, he noticed that a huge giant slept beside their cave, and his snoring shook the whole ground. The giant woke up, and he did not appear particularly threatful. Thor realized that the giant wore only one glove, while the other was actually the cave they were sheltered. The giant tried to pull on his glove, and Loki and Tjalfi fell from it. The huge giant introduced himself to the travelers.
"I'm Skirmir, and if you wish, I can serve as your guide, while also carrying all your luggage."
The gods accepted the offer. After all, they did not know the region that well, and having the opportunity not to carry their own goods would certainly be a great relief. Skirmir put everything inside his own bag and initiated the journey. The giant was now tired and decided to take a nap. Night came and the travelers started to feel hungry. They tried to open the sleeping giant's bag but failed. Unable to wake the giant, Thor, angered with hunger, grabbed his hammer and struck the giant's head with fierceness. After the blow, the sleepy giant said,
"A leaf must have fallen on the top of my head. Well, it was nothing anyway,"
and went back to sleep. Dawn was around the corner, and the hungry travelers waited for the giant to wake up to finally eat their breakfast. But Skirmir was still asleep. The angered Thor hammered the giant's head with all his might. Such a blow could destroy any giant's head, but Skirmir just woke up as if he had been bothered by an insect. Thor was amazed by the giant's endurance. No way a creature could withstand such a blow. After waking up, the giant said,
"Your destination is right there, where Utgaror is located, the place of my giant friends. There they call me soft and weak. I think it's now time for us to go."
Thor and his fellows went to the giant's palace. The god was a little worried. If Skirmir was the little one, what would he find in Utgaror, the domain of the king of the giants? Thor, his servant Tjalfi, and Loki were all exploring the kingdom of the giants, and they finally arrived at the enormous castle of Utgaror. The Aesir gods entered the palace and encountered the huge giants who lived there. The one who stood out the most welcomed them.
"Welcome to my palace. I'm the lord of this palace. I have always heard that you Asgardians consider yourselves to be the greatest of all. How about we take part in a dispute? I can defeat you in any kind of competition you can imagine," said Thor with confidence. "Calm down, Odin's son. The first to compete will be Loki, son of the glorious giant Lofi."
Loki would face Logi, the giant's servant, to know who could eat the banquet on the table more quickly. Loki and Logi started eating all the food with incredible speed, and they both finished at the same time. Loki ate all the food, but the giant Logi ate even the bones, platters, and cutlery, so he was declared the winner. The servant Thjalfi also engaged in a race against a giant who was still a child. Thjalfi was one of the fastest men that ever lived, yet he had no chance against the hasty giant boy.
For you, mighty Thor, I pose 3 challenges. First, you should drink all the beverage in this horn at one go.
Thor grabbed the horn with confidence, as drinking a lot was one of his skills. The god drank, and drank that salty liquid until he reached his limit. But he only managed to decrease the liquid that filled the horn a little bit.
Ha ha ha! You drink like a maid. I'll make it easier for you. In this next race, you will have to lift my pet cat.
You got to be kidding me, said Thor, approaching the cat. Much to Thor's surprise, the cat was incredibly heavy. The god of thunder managed to lift the cat over his head, but it could still touch the ground with its paws.
It appears that the stories they tell about you are just legends, and you cannot lift a cat up. In your last ordeal, you must fight my foster mother.
That was when an old giantess appeared in the room. Thor felt offended for having to fight this old woman, but he decided to fight her to secure at least one win for Asgard's team. The fight began, and Thor was surprised by the old giantess's strength. The god used all his strength against the old lady, and at times, it appeared that the victory was in his hands. But the old woman managed to drop Thor to his knees. Defeated, the gods and their servant left the Utgaror palace, with their heads pointing down. The king of the giants followed the Asgardians to his kingdom's boundaries, and, when saying goodbye, he declared,
"Now that we're alone, I can tell you a secret. I have fooled you all along."
The king of the giants said that he had disguised himself as the giant Skrymir, the one who had guided Thor and his fellows through Jotunheimer. And, had he not had used magic at that moment, he would have been dead. After all, when Thor tried to hit his head with his hammer, the god hit a mountain instead, turning the hill into a valley.
Dear Loki, you also have been deceived by an illusion. Actually, you were competing against a fire, and that fire engulfs everything in its path. You, Thjalfi, you competed against a thought, and even though you are extremely fast, nothing is faster than a thought. And what sort of tricks did you use against me in your palace? Said Thor, demanding an explanation. Now that we no longer have an audience, I can praise you for your strength and determination. The giant explained that the horn grabbed by Thor was connected to the ocean, so Thor was able to bring the sea level down a few meters, which was an incredible feat. As for the cat, he was actually lifting Jormungand, the world's serpent, and the mere fact that Thor could raise part of the snake off the ground was a huge accomplishment. Nevertheless, what stunned the giant the most was that Thor almost defeated the old woman, who was oldness itself, and time beats everyone down the road. Thor despised being tricked, and he would have crushed the giant, but he relied on his magic to vanish, along with his castle, for he feared the god's vengeance. The gods returned to Asgard. Thor knew that beating oldness or drinking all the water from the ocean was impossible, but defeating the world's snake was something he deemed feasible. And because of that, Thor started to wish to cross paths with Jormungand again, just to have the opportunity to beat it. Thor, the god of thunder, had won the mighty hammer Mjolnir as a gift, thanks to Loki's prank. With this hammer, Thor defended the kingdom of Asgard, tackling any sort of threat. But one day after waking up, Thor sensed that his hammer was missing. The god looked for Mjolnir in his room and only found a message which said, "If you want to recover your beloved hammer, visit me in my domains so that we can negotiate. You will get it back in exchange for an appropriate ransom." Signed, Thrym. Thor knew that nobody was a better negotiator than Loki, the god of mischief, and therefore he asked him to go to Thrym's meeting in the land of giants. Loki arrived at Thrym's palace in Jotunheimer, and facing the giant, Loki began the negotiations. Dear Thor, come closer, because my sight is not as good as in the past. You're now slimmer than the last time we met.
Loki noticed that the giant's sight was indeed impaired, because the differences between him and the god of thunder were enormous. After negotiating, the god returned to Asgard with Thrym's proposal and presented to the Aesir gods. The giant was willing to give back the hammer if Freya, the most beautiful of goddesses, was delivered to him as a wife. The gods considered the proposal outrageous, but without the hammer Mjolnir, Thor could not defend Asgard. That was when Loki had an unusual idea, to say the least. "Thor, I need you to wear this." It was a wedding dress.
How dare you insult me this way?
Calm down, calm down. I will explain my plan later.
Loki knew that the giant's sight was as good as a mole's, and so he wanted to take Thor to Thrym's palace disguised as the goddess Freya. Thor, without another alternative, dressed as a bride and went with Loki, also disguised as a servant of goddess Freya. When they arrived in Jotunheim, the ladies were very well received.
Welcome to my palace. I prepared a banquet in honor of the beautiful goddess.
The giant would have to be deeply short-sighted, to the point of confusing the bulky god, dressed as a bride, with a beautiful maiden. Soon after taking his seat at the banquet table, Thor began to voraciously devour everything in front of him.
Wow, such a voracious appetite you have, my new wife. I have never seen a goddess as gluttonous as you are.
Then Loki said,
I think she wants to finish the banquet as soon as possible, so that you can consummate your union.
Thor furiously looked at Loki, who appeared to find the situation quite whimsical.
Let's do it then. Bring the hammer, and we will seal this agreement and get things settled.
One of the giant's lackeys brought the hammer and placed it in front of the bride. Thor grabbed the hammer, and so he could finally unleash all of his rage. The god of thunder smashed all the giant's lackeys with his hammer, and Thrym had his head open like a melon.
Let's go home, Loki. I can't wait to get this damn dress off of me.
Don't you know that a good widow must wear black?
With the return of Thor and his hammer Mjolnir, the kingdom of Asgard was safe again, and the gods never stopped to have fun at the Valhalla banquets, telling the story of when Thor dressed like a bride. Loki, the god of mischief in Norse mythology, took part in many amusing adventures. But he also had an evil side, and from his seeds were born the creatures responsible for the ruin of the Aesir gods. He had a faithful wife named Sigyn. With her he had two sons, Narvi and Vali. Another famous son of Loki was Sleipnir, Odin's glorious eight-legged horse, conceived in an exotic story, to say the least. The god of trickery also had a mistress, Angrboda, a beautiful Jotun who lived in Jotunheimer. With her, Loki gave birth to a dangerous offspring. One night, Odin, the ruler of Asgard, had a vision. In it, the god saw a great combat between the Asgardians and the forces of darkness. Loki's sons would play an important role in this conflict. His last vision was of the jaw of a huge wolf. Then his field of vision went completely dark. Odin forced Loki to reveal where his sons with the giantess were. And so the gods set out for Jotunheim in search of Loki's sons. After arriving at the home of the giant Angrboda, the gods found the offspring of Jotun. The children still noticeably young. One of them was a serpent, the other was a wolf cub, and there was also a beautiful girl. When she turned her face away, the gods realized that the other side of her body was like a rotting corpse. This girl was called Hel, and she was a frightening figure. The gods took the children from Angrboda's arms and carried them to Asgard. The journey back to Asgard took some time, and Odin noticed that the snake seemed to have doubled in size. What was an ordinary snake was already the size of a python. Odin realized that the snake would not stop growing and would become extremely dangerous, so he threw the snake into the great sea that surrounds Midgard. As the years passed, the snake became so large that one day it found its own tail after circling the world. This offspring of Loki became known as Jormungandr. In Asgard, all the gods looked askance at Hel. Some were afraid of her.
Odin, noticing that the girl preferred to relate to the dead than to the living, appointed her as ruler of the world of the dead. She came to reign over the souls of those who had died an unworthy death and did not reach Valhalla. The wolf cub, on the other hand, began to be raised among the gods of Asgard and learned the language of the gods. His name was Fenrir. The god Tyr formed a bond with the wolf and became friends. Like Jormungandr, the wolf kept growing. He quickly became larger than a bull, and before long was larger than any animal on Earth. Fenrir inherited some of the worst traits from Loki, his father. After discussing among themselves, the gods realized that something had to be done. A wolf with that size could be a threat to all the inhabitants of Asgard, and the gods decided to create a plan to neutralize the danger. The mighty wolf Fenrir kept growling, and so the gods of Asgard were constantly watching him. All the gods looked with great suspicion at the beast, except Tyr, the god who held a bond of friendship with the wolf. The deities of Asgard forged powerful chains to try and imprison Fenrir, and to hide their intentions, the gods told the wolf they had a challenge. Fenrir, though huge and evil, retained a playful spirit and loved to play games. The Asgardians challenged him to get rid of the chains built by the gods, and Fenrir accepted the gag. The gods chained the gigantic beast, but the strong chains were useless against the strength of the wolf. A new chain was created, even more powerful than the first. The wolf pushed hard, and the chain seemed strong enough to contain the colossal wolf. The gods looked at each other satisfied. But Fenrir took everyone by surprise. He gathered even more strength and destroyed the chain. The gods were baffled by the sheer strength of the wolf. Fenrir noticed the distress of the Asgardians, a sign that they were up to something. There was no rope or chain capable of containing the creature's strength. But Odin knew that only the dwarves could create such. Odin ordered the elf Skirnir to go to the land of the dwarves, asking them to create something capable of containing the wolf. The dwarves agreed and sent the list of ingredients for such an object. These ingredients were odd. For instance, roots of a mountain, bear sinew, woman's beard, fish breath, bird saliva, and lastly, the sound of a cat's footsteps. After having all the ingredients, the dwarves set to work. The gods of Asgard were given a rope that looked like it was made of silk, but the power was not in its appearance. Fenrir was again challenged to try to break those bonds, but the wolf was already suspicious. Looking at the rope of the gods, he suspected a betrayal. Odin assured the wolf that it was all just a joke, but the wolf and Odin never got along, and as the son of Loki, Fenrir could smell the lie on Odin's breath. The wolf said that he would only participate in the prank if a god dared to put his hand inside his mouth while the animal was being held, and if there was treachery, he would devour the hand without hesitation. The gods looked at each other and the wolf confirmed his suspicion. But Tyr, the god who always fed Fenrir and with whom the animal had a certain friendship, offered to put his hand in the wolf's mouth. Fenrir agreed to be bound again by the gods. The wolf struggled against the bindings, but with all of his might he could not break the mighty rope made by the dwarves. Fenrir noticed the gods' satisfaction and looked at Tyr, the only one who didn't look cheerful. Then the wolf realized that he had been betrayed by the gods and even by his only friend. Fenrir closed his jaw as hard as he could, pulling Tyr's hand away. The god endured the pain without groaning. The brave Tyr was celebrated for his sacrifice. Fenrir was firmly bound to a rock. The gods of Asgard were finally relieved to have neutralized such a threat. The wolf cried out in fury, insulting the gods, and saying he could have been their friend. But in the face of that betrayal, they were now his greatest enemies. Fenrir vowed that he would seek Odin on the battlefield during Ragnarok and have his revenge. The gods of Asgard had traveled to visit the place of Aegir, a sea deity much worshipped by sailors. The banquets in his place were legendary, as a formidable mead was served. But Aegir was in no mood to organize a great feast for the gods. He made up an excuse.
I would love to welcome you with all my hospitality, but since you are many, I won't be able to produce the mead you desire so much. To satiate the gods, you would need a huge cauldron. Without it, it is impossible.
Tyr, the god of war, whose father was a huge giant named Hymir, knew that his progenitor had a huge cauldron that would satisfy Aegir's needs. Tyr and Thor decided to go in search of the giant. When they arrived at the giant's home, the gods of Asgard were greeted by Tyr's mother. The god asked his mother to lend him the huge cauldron, but she replied that Tyr should please Hymir, as it would be the easiest way to get what he wanted. The giant Hymir invited the gods to a meal. Thor was famous for being a great glutton and confirmed his reputation by devouring a whole ox. Faced with this, the giant said,
I'm going out to fish for some whales. I don't want to be known as a host who failed to feed his guests.
Thor wanted to go with the giant on his fishing trip, but Hymir didn't care.
This is not a job for the tiny residents of Asgard.
The god of thunder felt challenged and claimed that he was a better fisherman than anyone else. The giant pushed a boat into the water and they set out to fish. The gods headed out to the open sea in search of larger prey. Hymir quickly caught something, and considering the strength required, the giant thought it would be something exceptionally large. A large whale jumped out of the water with the hook in its mouth, and the giant challenged Thor to catch something bigger. But Thor replied that he could fish for something even bigger, and paddled off into deeper water.
You are crazy, Asgardian. This is the territory of Jormungandr, the serpent of the world.
Despite Hymir's warning, Thor was not afraid and used a bull's head as bait to start his fishing trip. The god felt he had caught something big, and the boat began to be pulled by the creature. The gigantic serpent emerged, as Thor had succeeded in capturing Jormungandr. Desperate, Hymir shouted for Thor to cut the fishing line. Otherwise, they would be taken to the bottom of the ocean. But Thor had already met Jormungandr once, when he visited the palace of Utgard. Thor was defeated, but he had sworn to himself that he would eventually defeat the colossal serpent. The fight between the god and the serpent continued, and Hymir feared that they would be taken to the bottom of the ocean. Thor tried to bring the creature within reach of his hammer. Just as the god was about to strike the beast, Hymir cut the fishing line, and Jormungandr escaped at the last moment. Thor was furious and would have smashed Hymir's head in had he not fathered Tyr. After all, they still needed the cauldron. After filling their stomachs with whale meat, the gods set off with the cauldron. With the cauldron, Aegir made plenty of mead for the gods, who had a great time during their stay in the sea god's palace. But while all the gods were having fun, Thor couldn't forget Jormungandr, and vowed that he would kill that dark creature. They were destined to meet again in Ragnarok. Balder was the son of Odin and Frigg, the supreme gods of Asgard. The god was beautiful, kind, and charismatic, and therefore loved by all. Balder spread happiness wherever he went. The days of the gods and whoever was with him were perfect. But as night came, Balder's happiness dissipated while he slept. His sleep was plagued by nightmares. His beloved wife Nanna comforted him when he awoke frightened. No god knew the meaning of his nightmares. The wise Odin knew that, in the realm of Hell, the place where the souls of the dead who did not die an honorable death on the battlefield went, there was an oracle capable of deciphering those nightmares. Odin, disguised as a wanderer, went to the realm of the dead. After using the runes, the oracle answered, "Helheim is preparing to receive Balder. When sorrow ravages Asgard here in the realm of Hell, there will only be joy with the arrival of the spirit of the kindly Balder." Saddened, Odin returned to Asgard and told Frigg the sad fate of his beloved son. Frigg was determined to prevent Balder's fate. Knowing that Balder was loved by all, the goddess demanded that everyone swear to never hurt Balder, and so nothing could hurt the god. Even objects, plants, diseases, and weapons were pledged not to harm Balder. Loki, the god of trickery, was envious and jealous of Balder, but even he was compelled to take the oath. And so Balder became invulnerable to everything. The god was safe. Balder's invulnerability was cause for a joke among the gods. They threw objects at Balder, but everything was deflected. Thor hit him with his powerful hammer, but Balder felt nothing, and everyone in Asgard was happy to know that the beloved god was protected. Everyone except Loki, who was determined to find a vulnerability in Balder. One day, in hiding, he overheard a conversation from the goddess Frigg, who told a friend that she had managed to get everyone to take the oath. Everyone except the mistletoe, a totally harmless plant. But in Loki's evil mind, the mistletoe was not so harmless. After collecting some mistletoe, he addressed the gods, who were still having fun trying to attack Balder. Only the blind god Hod felt sad that he was excluded from the fun. How could he throw something at Balder when he didn't even know where he was? The ingenious Loki created a dart made of mistletoe and addressed Hod, telling him that he shouldn't let his blindness stop him from playing. Loki turned invisible and guided Hod to where the other gods were. Balder was happy to know that Hod would also participate in the game. Helped by Loki, he threw the mistletoe dart with all his might at Balder. Hod expected to hear the laughter of the gods, but a great silence fell over the place. Balder had been mortally wounded. As the god's body fell to the ground, the desperate gods mourned his death. And, as was prophesied, the world of the living was plagued by sadness after the departure of the beautiful and beloved Balder.
Loki, the god of deceit, had a great amount of wickedness inside him, and he seemed unable to contain such malevolence. Therefore, he planned to kill Balder, the most beloved of the gods. The gods sent Hermodr, the messenger of the gods, to the realm of Hell, the world of the dead. The goal was to have his brother Balder back in the realm of Asgard. Hermodr received positive news that the goddess Hel wanted to return Balder back to the realm of the Aesir gods, but only if all beings mourned the god's death and wished for Balder's return. The gods were pleased with that news, as Balder was loved by all. All beings were summoned to confirm their desire to have the beloved god back. Everyone confirmed their desire to see Balder again. But the gods learned that a giantess living in the mountains did not want the god's return. Because of her, Balder could not return, making all the gods sad. But it wasn't long before the gods discovered that the heartless giantess was Loki in disguise. Loki had already committed every mischief and then some, but the most recent exceeded the limits of the gods' patience. The Asgardians reached a consensus. Loki should be punished. Loki fled from the wrath of the gods and hid in the mountains, near a well where salmon swam. Loki took the form of a salmon and mixed with the fish so as not to be found by the gods. Odin, the father of all, was able to see the whole world from his throne. He quickly discovered Loki's hiding place. The trickster god knew that the gods would eventually find his hiding place, so he thought about how they would try to capture him. A bait and hook would be to underestimate the intelligence of the gods. Loki pondered and discovered that a combination of strings could form a mesh capable of catching fish. Loki created this instrument and the first ever fishing net. After understanding how it worked, he designed strategies to escape from the nets. Seeing that the gods were approaching, Loki threw the net into the fire and jumped back into the pit. The gods saw Loki jump into the river, but they didn't know how to capture him. Kvasir found the traces of the net, which did not burn completely, and understood the purpose of Loki's invention. The gods created more nets, using them to try to capture the trickster. Loki tried to escape in every way from the numerous nets thrown by the gods. Sometimes he would jump out of the water. Thor thought that if a bear could catch some salmon on the fly, so could he. When Loki, in the form of a fish, jumped up once more, Thor was ready to grab him. Loki was snatched by Thor and dragged by the gods to a cave, where he would receive his deserved punishment. He was bound and imprisoned by the viscera and sinews of his own son. The gods wished to kill the god because of what he had done to Balder, but Loki had made a blood pact with Odin. Despite their different origins, they were like brothers. Odin could not allow the extermination of Loki. But simple imprisonment was too mild a punishment for the traitor. So Skadi took a snake with a toxic saliva and placed it in a stalactite over Loki's head. When the snake salivated, its venom fell on the traitor, burning his skin and causing him enormous pain. Loki had a wife named Sigyn, who stayed by her husband's side while he endured his punishment. The faithful Sigyn tried to ease Loki's suffering by collecting in a bowl the poison that fell from the snake's mouth. As time passed, the bowl would fill and Sigyn would go out to empty it. When this happened, the poison would fall back on Loki's skin and he would cry out in pain. The devoted wife returned as quickly as possible to her post, where she tried to ease her husband's suffering. Each drop of poison that fell on Loki only increased his desire for revenge. The god vowed to repay the gods of Asgard for all the suffering imposed upon him at their reunion during Ragnarok.
In Midgard lived the men descended from Ask and Embla, the first human couple created by the gods. Humanity lived under the protection of the gods, who always shielded the species against the forces of chaos. Thor, the exterminator of giants, prevented the land of men from being conquered by Mjolnir. With the protection of the gods, humanity prospered, always paying the sacrifices to the gods. These men were used to dealing with the harshness of winter, always preparing themselves to face all the difficulties that a long and icy winter could impose. But even men knew that the region of the gods would not last forever, and that the divinities of Asgard would have to struggle to face the forces of evil during the Ragnarok. In Midgard, the summer was coming to an end. Everything indicated that men would have a huge harvest ahead. But a cold wind began to blow, and the totally unexpected frosts destroyed much of the crop. The leaves of the trees quickly took on the colors of autumn and began to fall much earlier than expected, a sign of the approach of a harsh winter. Even with the crops ruined, the men tried to prepare themselves in the best possible way to face the winter. But despite all humanity's determination, sufficient preparation for the coming nightmare was impossible. After all, Fimbulwinter had arrived, bringing a long winter with it. 3 winters would follow, without any summer between them. Men and their farm animals took refuge from the intense cold in their shelter, where they tried to survive in the freezing cold. The nights seemed longer and longer. Every night men feared that the sun would never rise again. Their food stocks ran out, and, forced by hunger, they had to eat all the chickens that gave them eggs, and even their pets. Those who risked facing the cold, looking for an animal to slaughter, became easy prey for the pack of Fenrir's children. The men started to fight among themselves for the few existing resources. Brother fought against brother. Children challenged fathers. Chaos settled among men. The hatchets of war were always drenched in blood. The lack of food forced many people into cannibalism. The few remaining human beings were quickly falling apart. In Asgard, the Aesir gods noticed the signs that the ultimate combat between the gods and the forces of chaos was approaching. This cataclysmic event would become known as Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. After 3 practically uninterrupted winters, chaos reached the kingdom of men. Few survived the bloody anarchy that followed. The conditions prophesied for the beginning of Ragnarok materialized. 2 wolves, who claimed to be Fenrir's children, crossed the skies, chasing the sun and the moon. The wolf Hati was chasing the moon, while Skull was chasing the sun. The deities that personified the 2 stars managed for a long time to escape the wolves, but they couldn't escape Fenrir's offspring forever. The wolves finally reached their prey and swallowed them. Without sun and moon, the world plunged into darkness. The end was near. Great earthquakes shook Yggdrasil, the tree of the world. Cracks opened in the ground, and mountains collapsed. The rock where the powerful wolf Fenrir was washed away. The giant wolf was finally free, thirsting for revenge. Jormungandr, the snake of the world, moved in the waters, causing huge waves. These tsunamis devastated the few coastal cities that still resisted. The colossal serpent unleashed its terrible poison by contaminating the waters. From the smallest living beings like the plankton to the largest whales, all died intoxicated by the terrible serpent. Loki, who was imprisoned and subjected to terrible torment, was freed from his bonds. Like his son Fenrir, Loki had only one wish in his heart: to destroy the gods of Asgard. The god of lies descended to Helheim, the kingdom where the souls of those who died an unworthy death would go. There, Hel was sovereign. The queen of the world of the dead handed over the command of an army of the undead to her father. This army was composed of the corpses of those who died a shameful death. These Nordic zombies were eager to achieve the glory they did not achieve while they were alive. Ndogr, the dragon who gnawed at the roots of the tree of the world, dug a huge tunnel through which the armies of the dead would march to the land of men. Great flames of fire signaled that the army of Muspelheim was on the march. The giants of the Flaming Lands were led by Surtur the Black. The huge giant burned everything that was in his way, using his flaming sword. The ice giants of Jotunheimer embarked on ships towards Vigrid, the chosen place to be the battlefield between gods and forces of chaos. Heimdall, the herald of the gods, had no more doubts. Ragnarok had begun. The god finally blew the horn Jallarhorn, and its sound was heard throughout the universe. Everyone was afraid of this alert. The end of the age of the Aesir gods was approaching. The great battle would begin. Heimdall's horn announced that the day of the final battle had finally arrived. The forces of chaos, led by Loki, were eager to end the reign of the Aesir gods, using all available means to achieve this goal. The gods of Asgard knew that the great battle was inevitable. For millennia they prepared for the great day. The gates of Valhalla opened, and thousands of warriors left the great hall, and formed the great army of Odin. This army was formed by the bravest warriors who, during their lives, fought bravely on the battlefield. These were taken by the Valkyries to the halls of Valhalla, where they waited for the opportunity to show again all their courage, fighting alongside the gods during the Ragnarok. All the gods capable of wielding a weapon joined the combatants. The huge army of Muspelheim's giants set off for Asgard, trying to destroy the gates that protected the dwelling of the gods. Suddenly, the Bifrost Bridge collapsed, and part of the great army fell into the waters. The Asgardians celebrated while the giants drowned in the river. But the gods knew that their destiny was not to hide behind the powerful walls made by the giant builder. Their destiny was to face with honor the forces of darkness in an open field. Odin, riding his glorious 8-legged horse, gave orders to start the attack. The army of the gods advanced against its enemies. When the armies clashed, the impact was so powerful that it made Yggdrasil, the tree of the worlds, tremble. Thor, the champion of the gods, wanted to crush the heads of thousands of giants and slaughter hundreds of enemies at a time. The ice giants were led by Hrym in the final battle, facing with great courage the hordes of Odin. Loki guided Hel's armies of the undead, composed of those who died an unworthy death. Freyr, the god Vanir, fought bravely, riding his golden boar next to the Asgardians. The brave god attacked Surtur, the powerful leader of the fire giants of Muspelheim. Freyr gave everything he had, but it wasn't enough to defeat Surtur, who shot down the Vanir god with his flaming sword. Before dying, Freyr repented for giving his magic sword to Skirnir. With it, everything could have been different. Freyr was the first of the gods to fall on the battlefield, and many others would follow him. Tyr, the warrior god who sacrificed his hand so that the gods could arrest Fenrir the wolf, would also fall after facing Garm, the powerful wolf of Hel, who defended the world from the dead. But before his death, Tyr still managed to stick his sword into the heart of the infernal beast. The battlefield shook when Jormungandr, the world serpent, presented itself for battle. The creature expelled a cloud of poisonous gases, capable of slaughtering the warriors of the gods. When he saw the serpent, Thor was filled with enthusiasm, for he had long been waiting for the decisive fight against his old rival. The struggle between Thor and Jormungandr was epic, The giant snake tried to swallow the Asgardian hero, as he deviated from its knocks and counterattacked with powerful blows from his hammer. The god of thunder managed to incapacitate Jormungandr, and the latter fell wounded. Thor delivered a deadly blow to the serpent's head. The gods and warriors of Asgard vibrated with the victory of their champion. However, Thor's blow was so strong that Jormungandr's pockets of poison broke, spreading a poisonous cloud around Thor. Thor bent to his knees and fell dead. Without their great champion, the battle against the forces of chaos became even more difficult for the gods. Fenrir, the huge wolf son of Loki, devoured all those who opposed him. But what he most desired was to find Odin, his mortal enemy. The supreme god of Asgard knew that his destiny was to fight the dreaded wolf son of Loki, and didn't run away from the clash. Odin's spore Sleipnir and advanced against Fenrir. But Odin's fate was not to come out of this dispute alive. Fenrir opened his huge mouth and devoured the father of all. The gigantic wolf humiliated the gods after his victory against the wisest deity. The provocation filled the heart of Vidar, son of Odin, with hatred. Such fury gave him great strength. Vidar attacked Fenrir, and this one tried to take him over. Vidar put his feet on the wolf's tongue, and his strong arms pulled his teeth away. His strength was so great that he opened Fenrir's jaw in half. The gigantic wolf died. Even with the death of his sons, Loki was satisfied with the carnage, as he watched the gods fall one after the other. Heimdall, the guardian of the Rainbow Bridge, advanced through Hel's army of the dead, opening a path to Loki. Heimdall and Loki met in a duel, and the plasticity of the combat made it all look like a deadly dance. Loki and Heimdall struck each other several times. The duel did not have a winner, because both died. The giant Surtur set fire to the world with his sword, and the flames swallowed everything. There were no fighters left on the side of the living, nor the side of the dead. Only ashes on the earth. The flames reached Asgard and threw their palaces into rivers of fire. The level of the ocean waters rose to form a huge flood. There was nothing left on Earth. The era of the Aesir gods was over. The waters that consumed the land eventually retreated, and the plants sprouted again. A new sun arose to ward off the darkness that had taken over the earth. The Yggdrasil tree could not withstand the damage caused by Ragnarok, and fell. But inside the great ash tree there was a secret surprise. The gods had hidden a couple of mortals, so that the human race could resist the events of Ragnarok. Their names were Leif and Leifsbrasir. Through the love of this couple, the world was again repopulated. The kingdom of Asgard has disappeared, but the new kingdom, Idavolur, would take its place. The 6 gods took their places in Idavolur, the sons of Odin, Vidar, who killed Fenrir, and his brother Vali. Thor's sons, Magni and Modi, became responsible for the hammer of the god of thunder, defending this new kingdom. In the world of the dead, Balder, the dearest of the gods, together with Hod, rose to occupy the last places. There they recalled the old traditions and discussed the future, trying not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The gods found the golden pieces used in the games of the gods, and, just like their fathers, they started a new round of the ancestral game. A new cycle began. Asgard was home to the major gods of Norse mythology, known as the Aesir. These gods had no shortage of enemies, of different strains, but they all had one thing in common: the fear for Thor, the champion of the gods. With his mighty Mjolnir hammer, he could protect the citadel from the gods. But Thor had a restless spirit, always ready to embark on an adventure. He constantly traveled, looking for new challenges. During Thor's absence, Asgard was vulnerable to its enemies. At a meeting, the gods decided that a powerful wall would have to be built for protection purposes. But some gods argued that building such a wall would take years. Then a strong traveler emerged from the woods, claiming to be a great builder, ready to build the wall in record time. As a reward, he wanted the beautiful goddess Freya as his wife. The gods swiftly rejected such an outrageous proposal. But the much clever Loki noticed that the builder's proposal wasn't that bad. "You shall think with me, friends. He says he can build this massive wall in just a year, which is impossible. Put it this way, if he doesn't finish the wall within that time frame, he'll get nothing. Well, the task is unsurmountable. When time runs out, he will have built a fair share of the wall, and it will be up to us only to finish what is missing. We will be saving a great deal of effort." The gods looked at each other and agreed. It was a good idea. Now convinced, the gods presented the builder with that proposal. He was deeply pleased and left to get his tools. The builder started his work. He was quite strong and managed to stack the stones easily. He also had the help of a powerful horse, who brought him the stones from distant quarries. Time passed, and the wall was quickly gaining form. The deadline was around the corner, but the gods noticed that there was very little left for the builder to finish. Odin was furious with Loki.
"Look what you have done! The wall is almost finished, and we will certainly lose our beloved Freya to this man. And this is all your fault."
"I told you he wouldn't be able to build this wall, and I'll make sure he doesn't." Loki realized that, without the help of his powerful stallion, the builder wouldn't have the required stones to complete the task. He devised a plan to keep the great horse away from the building site. The wicked god, using the power of metamorphosis, became a beautiful mare, intending to seduce the great horse. The powerful equine was dazzled by the god in disguise. The builder tried to contain his horse's impetus, but he was too strong and ran away, chasing the divine mare. The desperate Loki ran as fast as he could and disappeared on the horizon, with the stallion on his trail. The builder, without the help of his horse, failed to finish his work on time and rebelled against the gods. He ripped off his cloak and revealed his identity. He was a giant. Furious, he shouted,
"Damn the gods of Asgard! You're nothing but cheats! You'll meet your end!"
The furious giant set out to attack the gods. Thor, otherwise known as the exterminator of giants, fought against him and crushed his head with his hammer. The gods completed the rest of the wall, and Asgard was safe. However, a long time passed before Loki's return, who disappeared while attempting to escape the mighty horse. It took some time, but the god returned at last. He brought with him an exotic 8-legged colt, who pursued Loki wherever he went. Loki offered the colt to Odin and assured him that when he grew up, he would become the fastest and most powerful horse that ever lived. There was only one demand. No one could ever ask him the origin of the majestic horse, which would become known as Sleipnir.